The old transport shuttle rattled as it descended through the dense, violet-tinted clouds of Alara Prime. Elias Marston tightened his grip on the worn leather strap above his seat, feeling the turbulence as sharply as the memories pressing against his chest. He hadn't seen Jonah Voss in nearly a decade, not since their final mission together. But now he was returning because of a single message. Jonah Voss is dead. His estate is yours. Come at once. The words still echoed in his mind, cold and final. He didn't know what twisted sense of responsibility had driven him to accept the summons. But now he was here, stepping off the shuttle into the crisp, star-silver air of the Voss estate. A sprawling, alien fortress of glass and stone perched on a jagged cliff overlooking an endless ocean. A tall, severe-looking man in formal planetary legal robes waited near the entrance. "Mr. Marston," the man greeted, extending a hand. "I'm Executor Valen, appointed to settle Captain Voss's affairs. Thank you for coming." Elias only nodded. His gaze was fixed on the towering entrance doors inscribed with shimmering alien runes. The estate was both majestic and foreboding, much like Jonah himself. Valen gestured for him to follow. "We'll proceed to the inheritance ceremony immediately." They entered a grand hall filled with flickering bioluminescent lanterns and towering windows open to the stormy sea. The scent of salt and alien blooms hung in the air, sharp and intoxicating. Elias couldn't shake the sense that he was being watched, though the hall seemed empty. The late Captain Voss specified that all terms of the inheritance must be accepted without alteration. Valen continued, his voice clipped and professional. His estate, finances, starship fleet, and his bonded life partner. Elias froze. "What?" Before Valen could answer, she appeared. She moved like living starlight, stepping from the shadows at the far end of the hall. Her skin shimmered with a faint, opalescent glow, and her long, silvery hair flowed like liquid moonlight. She wore ceremonial robes of dark indigo, embroidered with swirling constellations. Her eyes, impossibly deep and luminous, locked onto Elias, sending a jolt through him he couldn't explain. "This is Kayla," Valen explained carefully. "A Lutheri bonded mate." Elias struggled to process the words. He had seen Lutheri before in distant war zones, an ancient race of empaths and energy weavers, bound for life to their chosen mates. He thought of Jonah, the fierce, stubborn captain who had somehow earned the devotion of such a being. "She is my responsibility now?" Elias asked, his voice rough. "Yes." Valen's tone softened slightly. Her bond to Captain Voss ended upon his death. Without a new emotional anchor, her life force will fade. Slowly but inevitably. He hesitated. "You are her last hope, Mr. Marston. Jonah trusted only you." Kayla stepped closer, her luminous gaze unwavering. Her presence was overwhelming, both delicate and powerful, like standing too close to a fire. Elias felt exposed under her intense scrutiny, as if she could see every scar, every wound he tried to hide. "I do not wish to be a burden," she said softly, her voice like a whispered melody. "But I cannot survive alone." Her plea struck something deep inside him, something he'd long buried. He clenched his fists, resisting the tide of emotions threatening to break free. This was madness. He was no savior, no protector. He couldn't be what she needed. "I'm not the man Jonah thought I was," Elias muttered. "You're better off without me." He turned sharply, heading toward the exit, desperate for air, for distance. But before he could leave, her voice echoed through the hall, tinged with desperation and something more intimate, something he couldn't ignore. "If you leave, I will die." The words shattered his resolve. He stopped, his breath ragged. Slowly he turned back. Her expression was serene, but her eyes held raw vulnerability, an openness he hadn't seen in anyone for years. Elias took a slow, reluctant step forward, then another until he stood just within reach. His calloused hand twitched at his side, aching to reach out, to touch her, but he held back. "You don't even know me," he said hoarsely. "Why trust me?" Kayla's gaze softened, shimmering with something ancient and unknowable. Because Jonah believed in you. She paused, her voice trembling. And because when you look at me, you feel it too, don't you? The distance between them felt impossibly small yet vast. His heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt something crack within him. Not pain, but possibility. He exhaled slowly, lowering his head. What happens if I stay? Kayla reached out, her slender fingers brushing his wrist, sending a pulse of warmth through his skin. Her touch was electric yet soothing, drawing him into her strange, luminous world. If you stay, she whispered, we begin together. The ocean roared outside as the storm broke, and for the first time in a long while, Elias didn't feel the need to run. Elias Marston had faced war zones, hostile planets, and betrayals that shattered his faith in humanity. But nothing left him as unsteady as the quiet stillness of the Voss estate after accepting its strange, impossible terms. He now found himself tied to Kayla, a luminous being whose very survival depended on a connection he wasn't sure he could give. The storm outside raged on, winds howling like restless ghosts. Inside, the estate was eerily silent, filled with shadows that flickered under the soft, bioluminescent lights embedded in the walls. Elias's boots echoed on the marble floors as he paced restlessly through the cavernous living hall, wrestling with his decision. Jonah's journals lay spread across a wide stone table, their leather-bound covers cracked from age. Pages filled with tight, precise writing told of adventures, battles, and Kayla. Jonah had written about her often, in ways Elias couldn't bring himself to read closely. The words radiated devotion, something too raw, too intimate to intrude upon. Elias slammed one of the journals shut, his breath tight. He didn't belong here. He was a man worn thin by war and regrets, bound by a promise made to a friend he couldn't even say goodbye to. He should have walked away, but her voice still echoed in his mind. If you leave, I will die. He couldn't shake the way she'd looked at him. Steady, knowing, yet vulnerable, as if she'd already seen every damaged piece of him and still believed he could be enough. Footsteps, light, almost soundless, drew his attention. He turned sharply to see Kayla standing at the edge of the room, her flowing silver hair catching the soft, ambient glow from the walls. She wore a simple, sleeveless robe of deep indigo that shimmered like starlit water, its edges swirling with glowing, constellatory patterns that shifted as she moved. I didn't mean to intrude, she said softly, her melodic voice cutting through the stillness. You seemed troubled. Elias rubbed the back of his neck. Troubled's just how I live. She stepped closer, her bare feet gliding soundlessly over the cool stone floor. You're not used to quiet places. No, his voice came out rougher than intended. Quiet's dangerous. Means something's about to go wrong. Kayla tilted her head, studying him with those radiant, knowing eyes. You've lived too long in war, he snorted, crossing his arms. You don't get used to it. You survive it. She paused, searching his face. Is that what you think this is? Surviving? Elias stiffened. She was too perceptive, cutting through the walls he built with a few gentle words. It's what I know. Without breaking eye contact, she moved closer until there was only a breath of space between them. Her presence was warm, magnetic, drawing him in despite himself. Her fingers hovered just over his arm, not quite touching, her expression carefully open. We cannot survive like this, she whispered. Not apart. His heart pounded. I'm not good at this. Kayla smiled faintly, her lips curving in a way that sent heat spiraling through his chest. Neither am I. Before he could respond, she lifted her hand, her fingertips brushing the rough, callous skin of his forearm. Her touch sent a jolt through him. Not just warmth, but something deeper. An undeniable pull that made his breath hitch. She traced a slow line across his wrist, her touch light yet charged with meaning. Elias clenched his jaw, fighting against the rising tide of emotion threatening to pull him under. You shouldn't. I have to. She interrupted, her voice trembling. It's how my kind connects. Through touch, through emotion. His resistance cracked a little more. And what if I can't give you that? Her fingers stilled, resting gently over his pulse, where she could surely feel the rapid beat of his heart. Her gaze softened with understanding, though sadness lingered beneath her luminous eyes. Her words crashed into him, grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. He'd thought he was protecting her by keeping his distance, but he was only pushing her closer to the edge. Elias exhaled sharply. You deserved someone better. Someone like Jonah. Kayla's expression softened further. Jonah chose you. He believed in you, even when you didn't believe in yourself. He couldn't meet her gaze, the memories of old failures burning too brightly. But she didn't pull away. Her touch remained steady, grounding, patient. If you trust nothing else, she said quietly, trust that you are still capable of being needed. The silence stretched between them, filled with the crackling tension of things left unsaid. Elias hated how much he wanted to believe her, how much he needed to, against every instinct telling him to run, to retreat. He slowly lifted his hand and placed it gently over hers. Her eyes widened slightly at the contact, a faint, shimmering pulse of light rippling across her skin where their hands met. He felt it too warm, electric, like a spark catching flame. I don't know how to do this, he admitted gruffly. Her fingers curled gently around his. Neither do I. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel dangerous. Felt hopeful. They stood there, connected by a fragile thread of understanding, both uncertain yet unwilling to let go. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside, something deeper began to take root. The morning light filtered through the crystalline windows of the Voss estate, casting shimmering patterns across the marble floor. Elias Marston stirred awake in the guest quarters, his mind already braced for battle, a habit long ingrained from years spent on hostile planets. For a brief, disorienting moment, he forgot where he was, until reality settled back in. He was here, on Alara Prime. Jonah was dead, and Kayla was now his responsibility. He exhaled sharply, pushing himself out of bed. The cold floor bit at his bare feet as he splashed water from the basin across his face, forcing himself to focus. Last night lingered in his mind. Kayla's touch, her steady presence, the way her luminous eyes softened when he'd finally reached back. It unsettled him how easily she slipped past the defenses he'd built over a lifetime. A soft chime echoed from the hall, pulling him from his thoughts. He dressed quickly in plain utility pants and a worn leather jacket, then followed the sound toward the estate's central atrium. Kayla stood by a wide, open window overlooking the ocean, her silvery hair catching the early sun like strands of woven light. She was dressed in a simpler, more practical outfit today. A close-fitting indigo tunic with shimmering embroidery tracing her shoulders, paired with soft leather boots that made her glide soundlessly across the floor. She turned when she sensed him, offering a small, hesitant smile. You're awake. Couldn't sleep much, he admitted. Place is too quiet. She nodded as though she understood. The estate's wards keep the outside world at bay. It was meant to be a sanctuary. For both of us. Elias shifted, uneasy with the gentle sincerity in her voice. So, what now? Do we keep pretending this arrangement makes sense? Kayla's smile faded just slightly, replaced by something more resolute. We can't pretend, Elias. If I'm to survive, we have to try. Before he could respond, Executor Valen's clipped, formal voice interrupted them from across the room. Mr. Marston, Lady Kayla. They turned as the stern-faced legal executor approached, accompanied by two guards clad in ceremonial armor. He carried a thin data tablet glowing with scrolling text. I trust you are settling in, Valen said, though his tone remained impassive. It is time to formalize the transfer of estate ownership and the life bond agreement. Elias frowned. We agreed to no such thing. Kayla's expression tightened, but she remained silent, her hands clasped gracefully in front of her. Valen raised a brow. The contract is clear. Without formal registration of the life bond, the inheritance cannot be finalized. Legally, both of you must consent. He paused, glancing between them. Unless, of course, you intend to renegotiate the terms. The implication hung heavily in the air. Elias's jaw clenched. He recognized a threat when he heard one. Kayla stepped forward, her tone cool and composed. Executor Valen, we will comply with the necessary steps. For now, we would appreciate privacy. Valen hesitated, clearly weighing his options. But after a long, calculating moment, he gave a curt nod and gestured for the guards to withdraw. You have until the end of the solar cycle to complete the bond registration. His voice lowered. Fail to comply, and the estate reverts to the Eleran High Council. With that, he turned and left, his heavy boots echoing across the marble floor. Elias exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. So that's it then? We're just supposed to bond because some bureaucrat says so? Kayla's expression remained unreadable, though her shoulders sagged ever so slightly. It was always going to come to this. Her calm acceptance hit him harder than he expected. There's no way out of this, is there? No, her voice softened. But the ritual isn't just a legal formality. It's something sacred, real. She hesitated, stepping closer. I would not force it upon you, but without it, I will fade. Elias hated how powerless that made him feel. He was a soldier used to fighting battles with his fists, not navigating emotional warfare. But this wasn't something he could walk away from. Not when Kayla stood there, steady yet fragile, waiting for him to decide her fate. His voice came out rough. What happens during the ritual? Kayla's cheeks flushed faintly, her luminous skin glowing warmer. It links our emotions, our thoughts. We would feel one another in ways beyond words. Her gaze held his, open and unyielding. But only if you're willing. Elias felt his breath hitch. The intensity in her eyes left him unmoored, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been in years. For a moment, he considered running, retreating behind familiar walls. But the thought of her fading because of his fear clenched something deep in his chest. He took a slow, measured step forward until only a breath separated them. How do we start? Kayla's eyes widened, shimmering with something both relieved and hopeful. Slowly, she lifted her hand, hesitating just inches from his face. May I? She whispered. Elias gave a small nod, his voice too thick to trust. Her fingertips brushed his cheek, light as starlight, tracing the faint scar along his jaw. He shivered at the warmth that pulsed from her touch. Not just physical, but something deeper, something that resonated through his very being. Her other hand rested gently over his chest, right above his heart. Breathe with me, she whispered. Elias inhaled, his eyes never leaving hers. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he let the walls around his heart crack, just a little. He felt her presence sink deeper, not invading, but offering, asking for trust. Their breathing synchronized, slow and steady. The air between them grew warmer, charged with unspoken emotion. He couldn't look away from her, couldn't want to. Kayla's voice trembled with something almost reverent. Are you afraid? Yeah, Elias admitted, his voice raw. But I'm still here. Her fingers tightened just slightly against his chest, her gaze shimmering with unshed emotion. Then, we begin. The ocean winds howled outside as the first threads of their shared connection stirred. Fragile, tentative, but unmistakably real. The ritual chamber was vast and open, its curved walls etched with ancient, glowing symbols that pulsed softly like a living heartbeat. Thin streams of shimmering water flowed in quiet rivulets across the floor, carving luminescent paths toward a raised stone dais at the room's center. The air hummed with quiet energy, charged with something deep and primal. Elias Marston stood just inside the threshold, tense and uncertain, his gaze sweeping the alien architecture. The atmosphere felt sacred, old beyond comprehension. He could almost hear the distant echoes of long-forgotten rituals whispered into the stillness. Kayla approached slowly, her bare feet gliding silently over the smooth stone, her luminous silver hair trailing like liquid light. She wore ceremonial robes of dark indigo that shimmered with faint constellations, their shifting patterns tracing an unspoken language Elias couldn't begin to interpret. Yet he felt the weight of meaning behind them. "You're sure this is necessary?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. Kayla nodded, her expression soft but resolute. "It is how we begin, is how we connect." Her eyes glimmered with something deeper than hope, something close to longing. Elias exhaled slowly. He was a soldier built for war, not for this strange, intimate ritual. But there was no turning back now. His fate, and hers, had already been entwined the moment he agreed to stay. She extended her hand, palm up, a silent offering. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, his larger, calloused hand settling gently against hers. Her fingers curled lightly around his, sending a warm, tingling pulse through his skin. "Follow me," together, she whispered. The flowing waters around them shimmered with faint light, illuminating the ritual circle marked by intricate runes. A soft breeze stirred, carrying the scent of ocean mist and starlit blooms. Kayla turned to face him, their joined hands still resting between them. "The bonding requires openness." Her voice trembled slightly but held steady. "I will not force anything you are not ready to give." Elias clenched his jaw, fighting the familiar urge to retreat. "What exactly do I have to do?" Her gaze softened. "Feel." Before he could respond, she lifted her free hand and gently placed it over his chest, right above his heart. Her fingers rested lightly over the worn leather of his jacket, a touch both grounding and intimate. "May I?" she asked softly, glancing at the barrier his jacket created. Elias swallowed hard, then gave a curt nod. His breath hitched as her fingers brushed the zipper, sliding it down with deliberate care. She helped him shrug off the worn leather, leaving him in a plain gray shirt that clung to his frame. Her touch lingered, featherlight and reverent, tracing the lines of old scars etched across his skin. Silent stories of battles long past. This is who you are," she whispered, her fingers brushing a faded, jagged scar along his forearm. "Your memories, your struggles." He stiffened. "They're nothing but mistakes." Kayla shook her head slowly, her luminous eyes never leaving his. "They are pieces of you." Her hand settled over his, grounding him in the warmth of her touch. "Let me share them." Elias's throat worked as he fought to steady his breathing. He hated how vulnerable he felt under her unwavering gaze, how easily she saw past his armor. But he didn't pull away. "I don't know how," he admitted, voice hoarse. Kayla smiled gently, her fingertips grazing his temple. "Then let me show you." A faint, glowing thread of light unfurled from her hand, weaving softly through the air like a living ribbon of starlight. It connected them, skin to skin, soul to soul, binding them with a warmth that pulsed through Elias's chest like an undeniable heartbeat. He gasped at the sudden flood of sensations. Not pain, but something deep, expansive, real. Memories stirred just beneath the surface of his mind. His past, raw and unfiltered, flashing like scattered constellations. Battles fought in desolate war zones, comrades lost, broken promises. Kayla flinched, her expression flickering with shared pain. But she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, her free hand rising to cup his face with infinite tenderness. "You are more than this," she whispered fiercely. Elias's breath trembled, his hand tightening around hers. "How can you be so sure?" Her gaze burned with quiet intensity. "Because I feel you." Before he could respond, she rose onto her toes, her lips brushing softly against his in a tentative, searching kiss. Not demanding, but asking, offering. Elias froze for only a heartbeat before surrendering to the pull between them. He cupped her face with both hands, returning the kiss with a desperate, aching need he couldn't suppress. Her warmth surged through him, chasing away the cold that had lived in his chest for far too long. The glowing threads between them flared brighter, weaving around their joined hands and entwined forms like shimmering constellations. The room itself seemed to respond, the etched runes pulsing in time with their shared breath. When they finally parted, Kayla's breath hitched, her luminous eyes shimmering with emotion. You accepted me. Elias rested his forehead against hers, still holding her close. I'm still here. The ritual chamber quieted, the pulsing glow softening into a steady, shared rhythm. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Elias felt something fragile but undeniable settle in his chest, belonging. Outside, the storm still howled, but inside, something far deeper had taken root. The stars outside the Voss estate burned bright against the dark sky, casting silver light over the vast ocean. The storm had passed, leaving the air still and heavy with the scent of salt and distant blooms. Inside the estate, Elias Marston paced restlessly through the wide, dimly lit hall, unable to shake the lingering sensation of Kayla's touch, the warmth of her fingers tracing old scars, the electric pulse of her kiss still burning against his lips. He cursed under his breath, running a hand through his unruly hair. Every instinct he had screamed at him to retreat, to build the walls he'd lived behind for years. The ritual with Kayla had gone deeper than he'd expected, deeper than he'd thought possible. He wasn't used to being seen, to having someone reach past his defenses and touch something so raw, so human. Yet, despite his unease, he couldn't bring himself to leave. Not when the memory of her voice, soft, steady, full of belief, still echoed through him. You are more than this. A faint shimmer of light caught his eye, drawing his attention down the corridor toward Kayla's private quarters. The double doors stood slightly ajar, faint silver luminescence spilling out into the hall like liquid starlight. He hesitated, his pulse quickening. Before he could reconsider, he found himself stepping closer, drawn by something he couldn't explain. The glow intensified as he approached, wrapping around him like a whispered invitation. He reached the doorway and paused. Through the opening, he saw Kayla standing at the center of her room, her back to him. She was bathed in soft, otherworldly light, her long silver hair cascading down her back in shimmering waves. The thin, flowing fabric of her gown shifted like starlit mist with every movement. She was tracing glowing symbols across the air with delicate, fluid motions, alien glyphs that pulsed faintly with each sweep of her hand. Her face was serene, yet her expression held a trace of something deeper, something longing and unresolved. Elias lingered in the shadows, uncertain if he should interrupt. But before he could retreat, Kayla spoke without turning. You don't have to stand in the doorway. Her voice was soft but carried clear across the room. He cursed inwardly but stepped inside, the cool stone floor silent beneath his boots. Didn't mean to intrude, he muttered. You weren't. She lowered her hands, letting the glowing glyphs fade into the air. Slowly, she turned to face him, her luminous eyes searching his with quiet intensity. You couldn't sleep either. He shook his head. Too restless. Kayla studied him for a long moment, then stepped closer. The bond unsettles you. It's more than I expected. His voice was rough, edged with truth he couldn't hide. I'm not used to feeling like this. Neither am I. Her gaze softened, shimmering faintly. The bond connects more than memory. It stirs emotions we try to bury. Elias shifted uncomfortably. I'm not good at this. Kayla stepped into his space, her voice lowering to something more intimate. Neither am I. Her fingers brushed his forearm, the faint glow of her touch sending a familiar warmth through his skin. But I want to try. He swallowed hard, fighting the instinct to pull away. But her touch was grounding, steady. She wasn't asking for anything he couldn't give, just his presence, his willingness to stay. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he reached up and let his hand settle gently against her waist. Her breath hitched, her luminous eyes widening just slightly. But she didn't pull back. Elias, she whispered, before he could respond. A sudden, sharp pulse of light rippled across the room, accompanied by a low, vibrating hum. The air crackled with strange electric tension. Kayla stiffened, her gaze snapping toward the nearest window. Something's wrong. Elias followed her line of sight, instinctively reaching for the combat knife sheathed at his side. Outside, the distant ocean shimmered beneath the stars, but something darker loomed against the horizon, shifting like shadows given form. "Stay behind me," Elias ordered, his voice hardening into the sharp, commanding tone of a soldier. He positioned himself between her and the growing disturbance outside. The hum intensified, resonating like a distant war drum. Subtly, an explosive crack split the air as one of the estate's protective wards shattered, sending jagged sparks raining down from the enchanted barriers. Kayla gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if feeling the ward's destruction like a physical wound. "They've found us." "Who?" Elias demanded, already moving toward the nearest weapons cabinet bolted into the wall. He yanked it open and grabbed an old plasma rifle, checking its charge with practiced efficiency. "Jonah's enemies." Kayla's voice trembled, though her expression remained fierce. "They came for what he left behind, including me." Before Elias could respond, a deafening blast rocked the estate, shaking the walls and sending waves of shattered crystal raining from the windows. He grabbed Kayla's arm, pulling her behind a nearby column just as another blast struck, leaving a smoldering crater where they stood and the harsh sound of boots striking stone. Dark, armored figures began to spill into the chamber, their weapons gleaming with cruel intent. "Stay close," Elias growled, gripping his rifle tightly as he assessed the oncoming threat. Kayla's eyes burned with defiant light. "I won't run." "Good," Elias muttered, bracing himself for the coming fight. "Because neither will I." Together, they faced the storm as the past came crashing down around them, leaving no room for retreat, only the will to survive. Blaster fire tore through the cavernous hall, searing the ancient stone walls and scattering shards of shattered crystal across the floor. Elias Marston moved like a man born for combat, quick, precise, and relentless. His plasma rifle barked with sharp, lethal bursts, dropping two armored intruders before they could fully breach the estate's broken ward line. "Get down," he barked, shoving Kayla behind a jagged marble pillar as another barrage of energy bolts streaked past them. Kayla pressed her back against the cold stone, luminous eyes wide but steady. Even with the air thick with smoke and danger crackling like live wires, she radiated a fierce, determined calm. Her breath came in quick, measured gasps, though her fingers trembled where they gripped the edge of the pillar. Elias dropped to a crouch beside her, checking the charge on his weapon. "How many?" he demanded. Her gaze flickered, pupils narrowing as she focused on the shifting energy signatures only she could sense. "6. No, 8, she corrected, wincing as another protective ward shattered in the distance with a resonating crack. "They've disabled the outer defenses." "Figures," Elias grimaced. "They're moving fast, trying to pin us down." A deep, metallic voice echoed from the far side of the room, amplified by a voice modulator. "Surrender the Lutherie, and you may yet live." Elias's expression darkened, his grip tightening on his rifle. Not happening. Without warning, two armored figures burst through the smoke, firing in controlled bursts. Elias rolled to the side, coming up on one knee as he fired back, cutting them down with brutal efficiency. His movements were fluid, precise, each step a calculated dance with death. Kayla watched in sharp, breathless silence, her heart pounding with something far more dangerous than fear. He fought not just with skill but with purpose, a fierce, protective resolve she could feel thrumming through the bond that tethered them. Subtly, a third attacker emerged from the shadows, lunging toward Elias with a wicked, serrated blade. Kayla didn't think, she moved, her hands ignited with shimmering, radiant light as she thrust her palm forward, sending a pulse of pure energy crashing into the assailant's chest. He crumpled to the floor, unmoving. Elias whirled around, eyes widening briefly at the display of power before snapping back into focus. "You can do that the whole time?" Kayla's breath came in shaky bursts. "It drains me." Then save it for when it counts, he ordered. We're not done. Before she could respond, another concussive blast rocked the room, throwing them both off balance. Elias hit the ground hard, landing awkwardly on his side as white-hot pain lanced through his ribs. He barely managed to keep hold of his rifle as he rolled into cover, gasping for breath. Kayla rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she pressed against his shoulder. "You're hurt." "I'm fine," Elias ground out, though his voice was strained. Her glowing fingers hovered over the dark stain spreading across his side. "You're not fine." Desperation edged her voice now, raw and urgent. "I can." "No," he growled, forcing himself upright despite the searing pain. "We have to move." Before he could finish, the distant hum of an approaching transport ship roared overhead, its engines screaming like a predator closing in for the kill. "They're bringing reinforcements," Kayla whispered, her voice tight with dread. "We won't survive another wave." Elias clenched his jaw. He could see it clear as day, the inevitability of their defeat. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and his strength was fading fast. His gaze locked onto Kayla's luminous eyes, wide with both determination and fear. She felt the same grim certainty through their bond, the sharp, aching knowledge that this might be the end. But then, something deeper stirred within her. A fierce, unyielding light that defied surrender. "I won't lose you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Before Elias could protest, Kayla pressed both hands against his chest, her fingertips glowing with intense, radiant heat. Power surged through her skin, flaring like molten starlight as she channeled every ounce of her being into the connection that bound them. Elias gasped, his vision blurring as a rush of searing warmth exploded through his chest. Not painful, but alive, electric, and consuming. His breath hitched as the burning pressure radiated outward, mending torn flesh and knitting broken bone with impossible intensity. His heart pounded in sync with hers, their shared pulse echoing in perfect harmony. Kayla, he rasped, but she didn't let go. Couldn't let go. "I'm not losing you," she repeated, her voice trembling with desperate conviction. The light surrounding them intensified, flaring like a living shield as another barrage of blaster fire shattered against an invisible barrier. Through the haze of pain and light, Elias felt something far deeper than mere survival. Something ancient, fierce, and undeniable. She wasn't just healing him. She was binding them together, fusing their life forces in a way neither could undo. Finally, the searing light dimmed, leaving the room bathed in eerie silence. Elias sagged against the stone floor, his breathing ragged but steady. Kayla collapsed beside him, her body trembling from the strain of the ritual. He struggled to sit up, cradling her gently against his chest. Her pulse fluttered faintly beneath his fingertips, fragile but still there. "You idiot," he whispered, his voice breaking. Kayla managed a weak, trembling smile. "You stayed." Elias cupped her face with one battle-scarred hand, his thumb brushing her cheek with infinite care. "You bet I did." Their gazes locked, raw and unguarded, as the truth of what they'd become settled between them. Something neither battle nor fate could tear apart. The distant rumble of enemy reinforcements echoed once more. But for the first time, Elias felt something stronger than fear. Hope. The air still crackled with lingering energy as Elias Marston pulled Kayla closer, cradling her trembling form against his chest. Her breathing was shallow, each breath a fragile thread tying her to life. Her skin still shimmered faintly, though the radiant light that had blazed during the ritual was now dim, barely flickering beneath her translucent skin. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice rough and frayed. His hands, battle-hardened and steady in combat, shook as he brushed a strand of silver hair from her face. Kayla's luminous eyes fluttered open, dim but still piercing. "You didn't run." Her voice was faint, each word a struggle, but her lips tilted in a soft, knowing smile. "Not my style," he rasped, his thumb gently tracing her cheek. "You're stuck with me, remember?" Her eyes glimmered faintly, the corners crinkling with quiet affection despite her exhaustion. Good. A distant metallic clang echoed from the far end of the corridor, followed by the heavy stomp of approaching boots. The enemy was regrouping, coming for them again. There was no time to rest. Elias cursed under his breath, shifting Kayla more securely into his arms. His mind raced through every possible escape route, weighing options like combat equations. His gaze flicked toward the shattered crystal windows lining the hall, where the ocean surged against the jagged cliffs below. "We have to move," he murmured, his grip tightening protectively around her. Kayla's fingers brushed weakly against his chest, her touch a ghost of its usual warmth. "The docks," she whispered. "Jonah's ship. Still there." His breath caught. Of course, Jonah's personal starship, the Starlance, was moored in the estate's hidden oceanside dock. If it hadn't been destroyed in the attack. "Can you hold on?" he asked, his voice low but fierce. Kayla managed a faint nod. "If you carry me." His chest clenched at her fragile bravery. Without another word, he rose carefully, lifting her into his arms as though she weighed nothing. Her head rested against his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck despite her drained strength. The heavy echo of approaching boots grew louder, accompanied by the cold hum of plasma rifles powering up. There was no room for error. Elias moved swiftly through the winding corridors, taking familiar turns guided by old memories of the estate's layout. His injury still ached, but adrenaline, and something far more primal, kept him going. They reached the wide hall leading to the docking bay just as the enemy patrol rounded the corner behind them. A warning shout echoed through the stone halls, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. "Hold on," Elias hissed, pivoting sharply as he ducked into a side passage. He pressed Kayla close against his chest, shielding her with his body as blaster bolts seared past. He set her down behind a heavy stone column and spun back, leveling his plasma rifle. His expression hardened into something sharp and dangerous, forged in countless battlefields. He squeezed the trigger, and the rifle barked out a controlled, deadly burst, dropping two of the advancing soldiers with brutal efficiency. The rest scattered, taking cover behind the smoking remains of a shattered column. Kayla stirred weakly, forcing herself upright. "Elias, you can't. Stay down," he ordered, his voice edged with steel. But even as he held the line, cutting down enemy after enemy, he could feel the odds shifting against them. More were coming. Too many. Desperation clawed at him, until Kayla's voice, soft but unyielding, cut through the haze of battle. "Elias, trust me." He turned sharply, his breath catching as he saw her struggling to her feet, her glowing eyes fierce despite her obvious weakness. She extended a trembling hand toward him, luminous threads of light unfurling from her fingertips like living starlight. Before he could object, the radiant threads wove through the air, connecting her energy to his. Warmth surged through him, not overwhelming like before, but steady, empowering. "We fight together," she whispered. Elias met her gaze, his breath shuddering with understanding. He reached out, closing his fingers around hers, sealing the connection. The room ignited. Energy pulsed outward in a dazzling shockwave, flinging the remaining enemies back like ragdolls. The light dimmed just enough for Elias to see the stunned expressions of the survivors, though still conscious enough to realize they were hopelessly outmatched. Kayla's knees buckled, and Elias caught her instantly, steadying her as the last of the glowing threads faded. Her breath trembled. "The ship? Go." Without wasting another second, Elias scooped her into his arms and bolted down the final stretch of the corridor, barreling through the docking bay doors just as the next wave of reinforcements surged into the hall behind them. The Starlance sat waiting, its sleek, silver hull gleaming faintly in the dim docking bay light. For a heart-stopping moment, Elias feared the vessel might be disabled, but its access panel still pulsed faintly with power. "Hang on," he whispered, pressing his palm against the ship's biometric scanner. A soft chime echoed in response, and the boarding ramp lowered with a smooth, mechanical hiss. He rushed inside, slamming the controls to seal the ship just as blaster fire lit up the docking bay behind them. The ramp snapped shut, and the ship's engines roared to life, vibrating beneath his boots. Elias collapsed into the pilot's seat, cradling Kayla against him as he activated the ship's controls with practiced ease. "Let's get the hell out of here," he growled. The Starlance surged forward, its thrusters blazing as it shot out over the ocean, leaving the burning estate and everything hunting them far behind. Kayla stirred faintly, her fingers curling weakly against his chest. Her voice was barely a whisper, but he heard her clearly through their bond. "We escaped." Elias pressed his forehead gently against hers, his breath still ragged. Not just escaped, survived. Their shared pulse steadied warm and strong, a promise neither of them could break. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Elias didn't feel like he was running from something. He was running toward something. Someone. And he wasn't letting go. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the cockpit's wide viewport, casting soft silver light over the dim interior of the Starlance. The ship glided through the vastness of space, engines humming steadily as if offering a rare moment of peace. But Elias Marston knew better than to trust it. His hands moved with practiced efficiency over the ship's navigation controls, setting random course shifts to evade tracking signals. The tactical map displayed no pursuing vessels for now, but Jonah's enemies wouldn't stop. They never did. A soft, uneven breath drew his attention from the console. Kayla lay stretched across the co-pilot's seat, her face pale and her silver hair spilling over the dark leather cushions like threads of moonlight. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her chest rising and falling in a fragile rhythm. Elias rose, his boots thudding softly against the metal floor as he knelt beside her. His fingers brushed her wrist, feeling the faint, flickering pulse beneath her delicate skin. A weak but persistent reminder that she was still alive. "Hey," he murmured, his voice rough with something dangerously close to worry. "You're not quitting on me now." Her eyes fluttered faintly, the soft glow in her irises dim but present. "I feel you," she whispered, her voice trembling but certain. Elias exhaled sharply, relief crashing over him in a wave. "You scared the hell out of me." His hand lingered on hers, calloused fingers tracing the faint glowing threads still faintly etched into her skin, remnants of the bond she'd forged to save him. Kayla's lips tilted into a faint, weary smile. "I thought you didn't scare easily." "Turns out I do," he admitted gruffly, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face with surprising gentleness. Before she could respond, the ship's proximity alarm blared, sharp and relentless. Elias surged to his feet, his heart pounding as he checked the console. Multiple incoming signals. Fast. Damn it. His hands flew over the controls, engaging evasive maneuvers as the ship banked sharply, skimming dangerously close to a nearby asteroid field. The tactical display lit up with hostile markers. 3 heavily armed warships, closing in fast. Kayla stirred behind him, struggling to sit up. "They found us." "Stay down," Elias ordered without looking back. His jaw clenched as he calculated their odds. Outnumbered, outgunned, and barely holding together after the last fight. Running wasn't an option this time. A voice crackled through the ship's comm system, cold and metallic. "Starlance, this is Captain Voran of the Dominion Syndicate. Power down your engines and surrender the Lutherie. You will not escape again." Elias's expression hardened. He cut the comm line without responding and activated the ship's limited weapon systems. Their shields flickered weakly, half power at best. Kayla struggled to her feet, leaning heavily against the co-pilot's console. "You can't fight them alone." "I don't plan to," he growled, locking in a tight combat trajectory. "But I'm not surrendering you." The first warship opened fire, energy bolts searing past the ship's hull as the Starlance twisted through the asteroid field with deadly precision. Elias maneuvered like a man possessed, threading through narrow gaps between tumbling space rock while firing controlled bursts from the ship's rear cannons. "We need more power," he muttered, pushing the ship's engines dangerously close to their limit. Kayla's hand brushed the console beside him, faint light sparking from her fingertips. "Let me help." Elias caught her wrist, his expression fierce. "You're still too weak. I'm stronger with you," she insisted, her voice steady despite her trembling frame. "We can do this together." For a moment, he hesitated, fighting against the instinct to shield her from danger. But her luminous gaze burned with fierce determination, leaving no room for doubt. "Fine," he relented, releasing her wrist. "But stay with me." Their hands met on the ship's central power core, fingers entwining as Kayla's energy surged into the ship's failing systems. A pulse of searing, radiant light flooded the consoles, igniting every dormant system with renewed power. Elias felt the bond between them intensify, locking them into perfect synchrony. Pilot and navigator, soldier and guide, bound by trust and something far deeper. "Hold on," he growled, locking onto the lead warship with cold precision. The ship shuddered violently as enemy fire struck their weakened shields. But this time, Elias didn't back down. He twisted the controls sharply, flipping the Starlance into a tight dive beneath the largest asteroid, using its mass as cover. Kayla's fingers tightened over his as she rerouted power to the forward cannons. Now, Elias fired, unleashing a blazing barrage of plasma rounds that ripped through the lead warship's engines, sending it spiraling into the asteroid field in a fiery explosion. The remaining ships scattered, caught off guard by the sudden, devastating counterstrike. "Next target," Elias growled. Kayla's eyes flared brightly, tracking the enemy ships through their shared connection. "Coming around. Left flank." He twisted the ship into a sharp roll, skimming dangerously close to another asteroid before banking into a flawless pursuit angle. The second warship tried to evade, but the Starlance was faster, more precise, powered by something far stronger than technology. The ship's cannons roared, and the second warship exploded in a blaze of fire and metal. The third enemy ship hesitated, engines flickering as though weighing its chances. A moment later, it broke off, retreating into the distant void. Elias exhaled sharply, his fingers still locked with Kayla's as the adrenaline ebbed. "It's over," she whispered, her voice trembling with both exhaustion and quiet triumph, his expression softening in a way that felt entirely too natural. For now, their hands remained entwined, still warm with shared power and unspoken meaning. Kayla's gaze held his, luminous and unguarded. "We survived." Elias cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing her cheek with infinite care. "Because of you." Their foreheads touched, breath mingling as silence settled over the darkened cockpit. The stars stretched on endlessly beyond the viewport, but for the first time, neither of them felt alone. They were still running, but this time they were running together. The silence of space stretched endlessly beyond the viewport of the Starlance, broken only by the faint hum of its repaired engines as the ship drifted through the distant fringes of the Eridani Nebula. Faint blue light from the swirling cosmic clouds cast shimmering patterns across the ship's dim interior, soft and still, like a held breath after the storm. Elias Marston stood alone in the cockpit, hands resting on the worn edge of the navigation console. His gaze was fixed on the star-streaked horizon, though his mind was far from the distant galaxies stretching before him. His fingers absently traced the deep grooves in the metal surface, scars left by years of battle, just like his own. He hadn't meant to stay up this long. His body still ached from the brutal escape, every movement a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. But rest felt impossible. Even with the enemy warships destroyed or scattered, the fight still burned hot in his memory. Footsteps, soft and measured, drew his attention. He turned just in time to see Kayla entering the cockpit, bathed in the nebula's faint glow. Her silver hair cascaded like flowing starlight over her shoulders, loose and unbound. She wore one of the ship's spare utility jackets over her simple tunic, though the sleeves hung long past her slender wrists. The sight tugged something deep in his chest. "You should be resting," he said quietly, his voice rough with concern. Kayla tilted her head, offering a soft, knowing smile. I could say the same to you. She crossed the small space, her bare feet silent against the cold metal floor. Despite her exhaustion, she moved with quiet grace, as though drawn forward by some unseen thread connecting them. I couldn't sleep, she admitted, coming to stand beside him. Her luminous eyes traced the stars beyond the viewport. It's strange being free. Elias studied her profile, the faint shimmer of her skin still glowing softly from the lingering effects of their bond. She looked fragile but whole, a light that refused to dim, no matter how much the universe tried to snuff it out. We're not out of this yet, he said gruffly. They'll come after us again. I know. Her voice was steady, unwavering. But for now, we're still here. He exhaled slowly, nodding. The truth of it settled between them, warm and undeniable. Kayla turned, her gaze meeting his with quiet intensity. You saved me. Elias shook his head. You saved me. More times than I can count. Her expression softened, shimmering with emotion she didn't try to hide. We saved each other. For a long moment, they stood in shared silence, their breath mingling in the stillness of the dimly lit cockpit. The universe outside seemed distant, insignificant compared to the fragile, living connection binding them together. Something deeper than fate, forged in fire and survival. Tentatively, Kayla reached out, her fingers brushing his wrist, a soft, grounding touch that sent a familiar warmth spiraling through him. His breath hitched, but he didn't pull away. You're still afraid, she whispered, sensing the conflict within him. Elias swallowed hard, his voice rough when he finally spoke. I've lost too many people. Too many things. His gaze dropped to where their hands touched, his fingers trembling faintly against hers. I can't lose you. Her fingers curled gently around his, her touch steady and sure. You won't. His throat worked as he fought against the walls he'd built for so long. But with her, they felt like hollow defenses, crumbling beneath the weight of something far stronger. Slowly, carefully, he lifted her hand, pressing it against his chest, directly over his heart. His pulse thundered beneath her palm, fierce and unyielding. I'm still here, he rasped, his voice trembling with raw honesty. Because of you. Kayla's breath shuddered, luminous tears gathering in her eyes but never falling. She rose onto her toes, her free hand brushing the side of his face, tracing the rough edges of old scars as though they were something sacred. You are more than what you've lost, she whispered fiercely. You are enough. Before he could respond, she closed the distance between them, her lips finding his in a soft, searching kiss, not demanding but offering. Her touch was warm and steady, grounding him in a way that left him breathless. Elias sank into her, his hands sliding up to cradle her face, returning the kiss with a quiet, desperate intensity. The taste of her filled every fractured part of him. Something steady and real, something he hadn't dared to believe he could have. When they finally parted, their foreheads rested together, breath mingling in shared stillness. His hands lingered on her waist, grounding himself in her warmth, her presence. I'm not used to this, he admitted softly. Kayla smiled, her fingers tracing slow, soothing patterns along his collarbone. Neither am I. The exhaled a rough, breathless laugh. We're really in this now, aren't we? Her luminous gaze held his, fierce and unwavering. Together, the ship's proximity sensors pinged softly in the background, signaling a new system on the horizon. But for the first time, Elias didn't feel the crushing weight of the unknown pressing down on him. They were still running, but no longer from the past. They were running toward something. Something neither of them could name, but both could feel. Hand in hand, bound by trust and something deeper than fate, they faced the endless stars. Together.